All right, let's dive right in. Imagine this. A mind, but not just any mind. No, this one is a masterpiece of pure reason. It can like dissect arguments, see outcomes before they happen, grasp the consequences of actions, all with perfect, like flawless precision. It's the ultimate logician. But here's the twist. This paragon of rationality commits an act, and it's an act that we, you, me, everyone listening would agree is wrong, deeply wrong. And the question we are grappling with today, the puzzle, the real head scratcher for philosophers is, can we truly blame them, this perfectly rational agent, if inside they don't feel the things we expect? No guilt, no remorse, maybe not even a twinge of simple regret. It's a question that I feel like could come up in any philosophy seminar.
Oh, absolutely. It's a classic thought experiment, the kind that really forces us to look at the core of what blame is. And, that's exactly the kind of foundational questioning we're going for in this deep dive. You, our philosophically inclined listener, you pointed us to a fantastic resource, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the entry on blame. And let me tell you, it's a really thorough, detailed map of this whole concept. So forget those everyday arguments and finger pointing. We are going deep into what blame actually is, and when it's actually the right thing to do. This is stuff philosophers have been debating for centuries, seriously.
Yeah, it's not just like, oh, you spilled the coffee, bad dog. This is deep stuff. So, listener, you, the philosopher in this scenario, wrestling with your own maybe unexpected lack of emotions, this deep dive is for you. We're going to break down the core of these philosophical debates about blame, lay out the main approaches, cognitive, emotional, conative, functional, all of them, with the kind of clarity and precision you, as a philosopher, would expect, of course. The SCP entry, that's what we're calling the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry, that's our guide. And our goal is to use these different frameworks to figure out, really nail down when blame is philosophically justified, especially when you think about the big concepts, things like moral responsibility, agency, the whole weight of blame itself, how it works.
You got it. The SCP entry is, it's amazing, rigorous, balanced, it covers everything. It's the perfect starting point for something as complex as blame. It's going to allow us to explore those subtle distinctions, those intricate arguments, the stuff that really underpins how we think about this universal human thing, blaming each other.
So right off the bat, the entry does something kind of interesting. It draws a line. It's a distinction that most people might not even notice in casual conversation. It separates out two types of blame. There's the interpersonal blame. That's the one we're focused on, how moral agents blame each other. And then there's the causal or explanatory blames. Think of it like this. Blaming the design flaw in a bridge versus blaming the engineer, the person who made that design.
That's a great starting point. Pamela Hieronymi, and she's done a lot of work on this, she points out something fascinating about forgiveness. Forgiveness, which is deeply interpersonal, requires us to not give up on the explanatory blame. Like, we still understand what caused the harm, but we're letting go of that personal condemnation. Think about a hurricane, right? It causes flooding, but it doesn't make sense to try and forgive a hurricane. So the interesting thing, and maybe this is surprising, is that the precise relationship, the connection between those two types of blame, the cause and the interpersonal one, well, it's not been studied that much. It's kind of underexplored. There's a philosopher, Tislenko, did some work on this back in 2021, shining some light on this.
Interesting. Okay, so we're keeping that distinction in mind, right? We are in the land of moral agents blaming each other. And then the entry does something helpful. It gives us four main schools of thought, four approaches to defining what blame really is: cognitive, emotional, conative, and functional theories. Let's start with cognitive. What's the big idea there?
Okay, so the heart of cognitive theories, they say that blame at its core is a judgment. It's an evaluation. You're making an assessment, about someone, their actions, maybe their attitudes, even their character. J.J.C. Smart, in some of his earlier work, he talked about this. He was differentiating blame from just plain dispraise. Like, you might dispraise a poorly written philosophical paper, but you wouldn't blame the author unless you thought, that the bad writing showed they weren't being intellectually responsible or something like that. It's a judgment with weight, It implies that they're accountable.
Okay, so it's not just like saying, oh, you got that wrong. It's more like, you messed up and you are responsible for the fallout. Now, Gary Watson, he takes this idea of judgment, but he adds what he calls the archaic perspective. How does that refine the whole cognitive view?
So Watson, He's saying that one way we blame people is by judging them against a standard of excellence.
Oh,
It's the Greek word arete. Think of it like their virtues or the ideals he should be living up to. And when they don't reach that standard, and this is important, and that failure is because their own evaluative standpoint, like what they actually value, then we can blame them. But it's important to remember that Watson himself says this is one form of blame. It's not the whole story.
Okay, so we're seeing blame as a judgment that's not just about spotting a mistake, but it's really about the person's responsibility, their character, their values. How do more modern cognitive theories build on this?
Well, modern thinkers, they often connect blame to judgments that really get at someone's moral or practical self. Scanlon, for example, he argues that when we judge someone's actions and it looks like their moral reasoning or practical thinking is failing, that judgment carries extra weight. Because most people, they care a lot about their moral standing and how others see them. Then you've got Zimmerman and Haji. They use really interesting language. They talk about blame as like judging a stain or a debit on someone's moral record, like their moral worth has been diminished. And Hieronymy, she focuses on the judgment of ill will, like deciding that someone acted with bad intentions, that they didn't care about the blamer or others.
Right. That makes sense. Like judging someone had bad intentions, that feels like a core moral failure. But the entry points out a challenge for these cognitive theories. It's that they might be mixing up blaming someone with just judging them as blameworthy. Can you break that down?
Well, what we see is that we can totally decide someone is blameworthy. Like maybe they did have bad intentions, maybe they did stain their moral record, but we don't always have to blame them. It's a subtle difference. Think of a co-conspirator. They know the crime is wrong, but they still might admire their partner's skill, how cleverly they pulled it off. So the judgment that the act was wrong is there, but the emotional response, the behavior, the things we usually see with blame, they might not be there. Maybe there's even admiration instead. And Pickard, she goes even further. She says sometimes you don't even need the judgment of blameworthiness to blame someone.
So just recognizing that someone did wrong, in your head, that's not enough to be blamed. There's got to be something more. And Watson, he has another critique of the purely cognitive approach, right? He says it makes blame too detached, like some cold, impersonal system of moral scorekeeping.
Exactly. He's arguing that blame is not about just recording moral faults from a neutral standpoint. It's about our own perspective as people in relationships, in a moral community. We're not just observers keeping track. We are invested. And this is where the emotional theories come in. They offer a whole different way of looking at blame.
Right, and emotions, feelings, they're at the heart of how these theories understand blame. And the entry, it traces this view back to a really important essay, Freedom and Resentment, by Strawson. So what is Strawson's core argument that shifts the focus to emotions?
Strawson's work, it's foundational. His main point is that this whole practice of holding each other morally responsible, it's deeply tied to emotions and attitudes, non-detached ones. He called them reactive attitudes. And these are just part of normal human relationships. For Strawson, seeing someone as morally responsible, it's not mainly about making a judgment about their actions. It's about how you react to them emotionally, how their actions affect you and those you care about. He really shifted the focus to those gut reactions, the feelings we have in relationships. And Wallace takes this even further. He argues that,
so it's not just, hey, you did something wrong. It's more like I feel resentful, indignant because of what you did.
Yeah, that's the core of it. And Wallace developed it into this idea of holding responsible. He's saying that emotions like resentment, indignation, guilt, they're not just passive feelings, they're part of blaming. And actually blaming someone, it needs that emotional part to be active. It's not enough to just think that an emotional response would be okay or appropriate.
And it's not just these reactive attitudes, right? There's a whole range of emotions that theorists say are central to blame.
Definitely. Strawson focused on resentment, indignation, and guilt, but other theories broaden the scope. You've got Wolfe, Shoemaker, Menzies. They emphasize anger. Bell points to contempt, and Portmore, he highlights disappointment and disapproval. But the thing that ties all these different emotional theories together is that, at their core, blame is about reacting to someone's wrongdoing with a negative emotion.
But then you have Scher. He throws a wrench in things. He questions whether emotions are always necessary. He gives examples like, what about blaming a historical figure, someone long dead, or blaming a distant government for a bad policy? We might not feel any strong negative emotions in those moments. Or even blaming a loved one. The emotions might be less intense, but we'd still call it blame.
That's a good point. And defenders of the emotional view have ways to respond. Some, following Wallace, might say that without that emotion, it's just a judgment, not real blame. Others might say, this is trickier, that you can be in an emotional state without being super aware of it.
And there's also this force objection. This is a big challenge for emotional theories. Hieronymy really pushes this idea. It's saying that blame, the feeling that it matters, that it demands a response, that seems to come from something deeper than just an unpleasant feeling. It's like the cognitive part of the emotion, the thought behind the feeling, that's what gives blame its power.
Right. Hieronymy is saying that if blame's power comes from the judgment within the emotion, then why wouldn't just the judgment itself count as blame, even without strong feelings? But Wallace, he pushes back. He says these reactive emotions, they're not just added on to an existing judgment. They change the meaning, the significance. They give it that expressive quality that makes blame social, interpersonal.
And then you have Fricker. She brings up the diversity of blame, how self-blame is different from blaming others, and first-person blame versus third-party blame. Can one emotion really cover all that?
Fricker's observation is smart. Blaming yourself for a mistake feels different than confronting someone else, and that's different again from someone else commenting on the situation. This variety, she argues, makes it unlikely that one single emotion is the key ingredient in all these different ways of blaming. Menzies pushes back a bit, though, saying maybe there's less diversity than it seems, and that the variations don't necessarily wreck the core idea of emotional theories.
Okay, so we've looked at blame as a judgment and blame as an emotion. Now we're moving into conative theories. They pour on spotlight on motivation, things like desires, intentions, our attitudes. Scher and Scanlon are the big names here. Let's break down Scher's approach first. What's his main idea about the motivational side of blame?
So Scher, as we mentioned before, he finds both the cognitive and emotional theories lacking. He says blame is a specific combo of a belief and a desire. First, you have the judgment that a wrong action happened. Then, and this is key, you have a desire, but it's backward-looking. You wish that wrong act hadn't happened. But this isn't just any wish. It comes from your commitment to morality. It's not just personal preference or regret. It's a deeper worry that the person messed up, that they didn't use their ability to make good choices and didn't respond to moral reasons.
So you're recognizing the wrong, but also wishing on a moral level that it hadn't happened. And Scher argues that this combo, this belief and desire, that's what leads to the emotions and behaviors we see with blame. The hostility, the reprimands, the expectation of apologies.
Exactly. He thinks this specific pairing can explain why we feel those characteristic emotions of blame and why we act the way we do when we blame. For him, it's the underlying motivation, the structure, that makes those outward expressions of blame happen.
But Hieronymy, she has a problem with this connection, right? Does this belief-desire pair really lead to all the blaming behavior Scher talks about?
Hieronymy thinks the link is weak. She might agree that it connects to our moral commitments, but she doesn't buy that those general commitments automatically translate into the specific and often pretty intense behaviors we associate with blaming someone. Like we can be committed to morality and regret a wrong, but that doesn't mean we'll feel hostile or start reprimanding the person.
And Smith has another objection. She focuses on the desire part. She says this desire that the wrong hadn't happened, it feels separate from the blame itself. Maybe it even comes after. She uses the example of blaming a politician for a bad war. Sure, we judge their actions as wrong and wish it hadn't happened, but is that desire really part of the blame?
She's saying that the desire and the emotions and behaviors that come from it, they're more like a result of blame, not a core part of it. She also points to examples where you have the belief and the desire, but not what we'd normally call blame, like a mother who thinks her son, a criminal, did wrong and wishes he hadn't, but her main response is sadness, not blame. There's also the sanitized critique, which says that Scher's theory is too neat and tidy. It misses the messiness of how we actually blame each other in real life.
Okay, let's shift gears to Scanlon's theory. He actually moved away from his earlier cognitive view. What's the new focus he brings in about our attitudes and intentions?
Scanlon, like Scher, comes to believe that blame needs to be more than just a judgment, but maybe not as much as a full-on emotional explosion or punishment. His later theory has two parts. First, there's the judgment. That someone's action has damaged a meaningful relationship, basically a judgment of blameworthiness. But then he adds the conative part. It's that you see your relationship with that person as changed because of this damage. And so you adjust how you think about them, how you want to interact with them based on that damage.
So for Scanlon, it's not just about making a negative assessment. It's about actively changing how you see and interact with that person based on that assessment.
Exactly. It's about the judgment and the change in your attitudes and intentions, how the perceived wrong changes where you stand with the wrongdoer.
But Wallace, always the critic, he argues that this theory leaves the blame out of blame. He says it's missing that feeling of condemnation, that moral disapproval that feels so key to blaming someone.
Wallace thinks that while Scanlon's focus on relational consequences is good, it misses that inherent feeling of moral judgment that many people think is essential to blame. Wolfe agrees. She gives the example of blaming a loved one for a small mistake. We might not feel the relationship is fundamentally damaged or need to change our attitude towards them, but we'd still say we're blaming them. And Scher comes back with his point about relationships. He says, what about when we blame strangers, people we have no relationship with, to damage in the first place?
Right. And while Scanlon tries to address this with the idea of a universal moral relationship that exists between all rational people, Scher's not convinced. He uses the example of a car thief, someone you've never met. Does this moral relationship really explain why you feel blame towards them?
Yeah, Scher argues that even if we accept this moral relationship, it's not clear that it plays any real part in our feeling of blame or our judgment that the car thief did wrong. It feels too abstract, too far removed from the immediate personal impact that seems to be a part of blame in closer relationships.
We've gone through a lot of individual accounts. Now the entry moves to functional theories of blame. What's the big shift in perspective here?
Functional theories, they're different. They're not trying to pin blame down to a specific mental state like a judgment, an emotion, or a belief-desire combo. They're looking at what blame does, its purpose in our social and moral lives. The idea is that blame is whatever fulfills a particular function, and different attitudes or responses might do that job in different situations.
And one of the big functional accounts is blame as protest. What's the main argument there?
Yeah, philosophers like Hieronymy, Talbert, McGeer, they've all argued that our reactions like resentment and indignation and how we express them, they work as a form of moral protest against wrongdoing. Smith even suggests that Scanlon's idea of attitude modification, that could be blamed too if it's done as a protest. And Perboom, he goes even further. He has a forward-looking account based on moral protest that doesn't even need those retributive emotions.
But there are some issues with this blame as protest idea, right? Like, can you even define protest without already talking about blame?
That's a key problem. The worry is that protest already kind of assumes some blaming attitudes or judgments. It could be circular. And then there's the fact that protest is about expressing something. So what about when we blame someone but don't say anything? Could that be protest? Does just having a negative judgment in your head count as protest?
And the entry mentions other functions of blame, like communication.
Right. Lots of theorists emphasize how blame is about communication.
Yeah.
It's how we show condemnation, disapproval, how we state what we expect morally, and how we reinforce norms. Duff, McNamara, McKenna, Bennett, Fricker, Mason, they all talk about this. Others say blame helps us stand up for values, signal our moral commitments, or share knowledge about how the moral landscape has changed because of a transgression.
But that unexpressed blame issue comes up again. If blame is about communication, what about when it's not expressed?
Yeah, that's a tough one for theories that focus on communication. Watson suggests that even internal resentment has this potential to be communicated, like it's ready to be expressed. But the exact meaning of that is still kind of fuzzy. Telek and Wang have been looking into this more recently.
Okay, so we've spent a lot of time on what blame is. Now the entry gets into when it's appropriate, and they use appropriate broadly to cover things like fittingness, warrant, permissibility. Fricker starts by saying that blame can go wrong in a few ways. The motive behind it, the intensity, how it's expressed, and who it's aimed at. That seems like a good starting point.
It is. Fricker's breakdown shows how complex it is to figure out if blame is justified. It's not just what wrong was done, but why the person is blaming, how much they're blaming, how they're doing it, and who they're aiming it at. And the entry makes a good point. Your theory of what blame is going to affect your view on when it's appropriate. Since we haven't picked a theory, our look at appropriateness is going to stay pretty general. Also, even though there are usual conditions for blame, they might not apply in extreme situations where the stakes are super high and the consequences of blaming or not blaming really matter.
So the entry breaks down the conditions for appropriate blame into three groups: facts about the person being blamed, facts about the blaming interaction, and facts about the blamer. Let's start with the person being blamed. The most obvious answer is blame is okay when the person deserves it when they're blameworthy. And for that, you need moral agency, right?
Absolutely. Just causing something bad to happen isn't enough to be blameworthy. Like, a hurricane can cause tons of damage, but we don't blame it the way we blame a careless person. Moral agency, that ability to understand and respond to moral reasons, to make choices based on those reasons, that's generally seen as necessary for blame. Now, what exactly makes up moral agency? That's debated, but it usually includes things like being able to reflect on your actions, think about different choices, make reasoned decisions, and have some self-determination. The tough cases are things like young kids or people with conditions like psychopathy. They might do things with moral consequences, but their understanding of morality and their ability to respond to it, it's either developing or impaired. Whether they can really earn blame, that's a big ongoing debate. Watson, Shoemaker, Nelkin, they all have different takes. But generally, to be blamed, you got to be able to think about your actions, reason about them, and decide how to act. If those things are missing, that's usually a reason to say you can't be blamed.
And then there's freedom and responsibility. That always comes up when we talk about blame. The idea that to blame someone, they need to have had some free will. Excuses like, I couldn't help it or I was forced, those often get people off the hook.
Yeah, that's a deep-seated intuition we have. We think you can only blame people for things they could have avoided, for choices they freely made. And this mostly applies to actions. It's interesting, though, Smith points out that if we think about being blameworthy for our attitudes, which we control less directly, maybe free will isn't as crucial for blame. Now, philosophers usually see free will as a kind of control. It's the ability to really choose between different futures to guide your actions based on your own judgments and reasons. And the big question, of course, is whether this kind of control makes sense in a world where everything's determined. But even leaving aside that debate, there are other things that can mess with freedom. Coercion, manipulation, huge pressure, strong temptation, or compulsion. These can really limit someone's freedom and how much we can blame them.
So, to be blameworthy, you need control, practical reasoning, and moral understanding. And they need to have used these in the action we're blaming them for. The entry also talks about epistemic conditions, the idea that if you didn't know something important and it wasn't your fault you didn't know, that might excuse you from blame.
That's a nuance we can't forget. Even if someone had control and moral understanding, if they truly didn't know something important, something that would change their actions, and it wasn't their fault they didn't know, then they might be off the hook. Genet, Millet, Robichaud, Wieland, they've all written about this connection between knowledge, belief, and moral responsibility. And even if someone really does deserve blame for what they did, it doesn't always mean blaming them is the right thing to do.
And that takes us to the second group of conditions, facts about the blaming interaction itself. Even if someone is blameworthy, it's not like any way of blaming them is automatically okay. The entry talks about procedural norms, like guidelines for how we should blame.
Right. McKenna, for example, he sees blame as like a move in a moral conversation. So there should be rules for when and how to make that move. And a key rule is proportionality. Like in the legal system, the punishment should fit the crime. The intensity, the way we blame, it should match the wrong that was done. A little annoyance at a friend who forgets your birthday, that's different from cutting off a family member who did something truly harmful. What's proportionate will depend on the relationship and the seriousness of the wrong.
And the wrongdoer's reaction seems important too. Smith says that if someone shows genuine remorse and tries to make things right, maybe more blame from others isn't needed.
Smith's point is, if someone owns up to their mistake, shows they're truly sorry, and tries to fix things, then more blame might not be helpful. It could even make things worse. Their own self-blame and attempts to repair the damage that shows they understand and respect the person they wronged. And with third-party blame, where someone who wasn't directly harmed is doing the blaming, it gets even more complex. How do you balance that with the victim's own response, especially if they've forgiven the person? Priest makes a distinction between spectator blame and associate blame. He's saying even if blaming on behalf of the victim might be wrong after forgiveness, a more detached kind of disapproval from a third party might still be okay.
And we have to think about knowledge and justification. In real life, unlike philosophy thought experiments, we don't have perfect knowledge.
Right. We rarely know everything about a situation or why someone did what they did. If we get angry too quickly, jump to conclusions without enough evidence, or rely on biased info that can make our blame inappropriate. The standards aren't as high as in a courtroom, but we should still have good reasons for blaming, as Coates and Rosen argue. Blame based on weak evidence or hasty conclusions can itself be criticized.
Finally, we get to the third group of conditions, facts about the blamer. The entry says that even if someone is blameworthy and the blaming is proportionate and justified, it doesn't mean anyone can blame them. Wertheimer and Cohen talk about this. They say sometimes it's not your business to blame, or that some people are just not in the right position to be morally critical. This brings us to standing to blame.
This is a hot topic in philosophy right now. The basic idea is there might be things about the person doing the blaming that make their blame inappropriate or illegitimate. The classic example is hypocritical blame, where you condemn someone for doing something you do yourself.
And the entry says that standing is used in different ways. There's a difference between the blame being morally wrong, like hypocrisy is wrong, and whether the person being blamed can just ignore it.
Yeah, that's important to separate out. Hypocritical blame might be wrong because it's inconsistent and unfair, but the person on the receiving end, they might have good reason to brush it off, to say, who are you to judge me? So you have the moral status of the blame itself, and then you have whether the person being blamed has to take it seriously. Those are connected, but different. And standing seems to be about more than hypocrisy. It covers things like being involved in the wrongdoing or just butting into things that aren't your concern. Radzik, he has this minimal understanding of standing. He sees it as just being eligible to blame. Like the person being blamed needs to be capable of being blamed, but the person blaming also needs certain qualities or a certain relationship to the situation to be eligible. It's like a basic requirement.
The entry mentions that some philosophers don't even like the idea of standing, or at least the idea that some people have more standing to blame than others.
Yeah, thinkers like Bell, Kang, and Dover, they're skeptical. They often say that even in cases of hypocrisy or meddling, the blamer still has some standing, even if the blaming is problematic in other ways. So they're not against the idea of eligibility to blame, but they don't think some people are more entitled to blame than others.
Let's talk more about hypocrisy. It feels wrong to blame someone when you do the same thing. The entry gives a few explanations for why it backfires. Wallace says it goes against this commitment to self-scrutiny that he sees as part of blame. It's like you're not holding yourself to the same standards. And it also violates the idea that everyone has equal moral standing. Fritz and Miller talk about an unfair, differential blaming disposition, and King focuses on misdirected attention, saying hypocrites should be looking at themselves, not criticizing others.
All good points. Wallace highlights the inconsistency of holding others to standards you don't apply to yourself. It's not respecting everyone's equal moral status. Fritz and Miller are pointing to the unfairness of blaming someone for something you do yourself. It's like a double standard. And King's point is, hypocritical blame often involves avoiding self-criticism by focusing on other people's faults.
And then there's the classic comeback, who are you to blame me? That feels like more than just saying the blame is wrong. It's like trying to shut the blamer down. How do philosophers see that challenge?
King sees it as a way to redirect the hypocrite back to their own behavior. But a lot of other philosophers see standing as a positive thing, like a right, a privilege, or even a form of authority. Fritz and Miller, for instance, they think that being hypocritical means you lose that right to blame. Herstein has another take. He says that the hypocrite might still be giving some kind of moral directive, but it's weak. The person being blamed can just ignore it without thinking too hard about it. Piavarki and Snedegar have similar ideas about how hypocrisy reduces the blamer's authority, their ability to make demands on others about that specific issue.
So why does being hypocritical actually undermine your standing to blame? Is it the mismatch between words and actions, the lack of commitment to the moral rule, or something about your moral standing compared to the person you're blaming?
It seems like a mix of all those things. Fritz and Miller say that hypocrisy rejects the whole idea of moral equality, which is the basis for the right to blame. Todd and Lippert Rasmussen, they focus on the lack of commitment. They're saying the blame is empty because the blamer doesn't really believe in the standard they're using. And the idea of relative moral status, that suggests that to blame someone, you need to be morally better, or at least not worse, than them in that specific area. And a hypocrite, well, they're not.
And beyond hypocrisy, the entry mentions other things that can affect the blamer's standing. Things like being involved in the wrong, meddling, moral luck, and claimant injustice, where social inequalities make it hard for someone to even be heard when they blame. With complicity, the problem is if you helped cause the problem you're criticizing, your blame doesn't carry much weight. The example of a superior officer blaming a subordinate for following their orders, that shows it well.
Right. If you were a part of the problem, it's hard to blame someone else. And this brings up tough questions like, can the government blame people for crimes if the government itself contributed to the social problems that might have led to those crimes? That's something Watson and Bede have explored. Lacey and Pickard have a different view, especially when it comes to the legal system. And Todd says that both hypocrisy and complicity show a lack of true commitment to the moral norm.
Then there's meddling. This is when blame feels intrusive, like it's none of your business. Radzik uses examples of neighbors interfering in parenting decisions, that kind of thing. It's like we don't have the right to judge every little thing everyone does.
This raises questions about boundaries, privacy, and how far our moral concern should reach. Why is some blame meddling? Well, it could be because of social norms about privacy, what's personal and what's not. Smith, Nagel, Gaukroger, King, Radzik, they've all written about this. There's also a connection to the legal idea of standing, as Sabini and Silver point out. Duff says that blame is based on being accountable within a moral community, and with meddling, that shared accountability might be missing. Even Scanlon's view, where blame is about damage to our relationships, helps explain why blaming someone for their private affairs feels wrong. And Snedeker makes an interesting point. She says whether blame is meddling can depend on the situation and how people usually act.
And then there's moral luck, where things outside our control affect our moral outcomes. Watson talks about Robert Harris, a brutal murderer with a horrible past. When you see how much those things affected him, it makes you think, there but for the grace of God go I, and it's hard to feel strongly indignant.
Watson calls this hesitation to blame, when there are strong mitigating factors, a kind of subjunctive hypocrisy.